Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Lake Lord Town Council, I want to welcome all our visitors, our citizens here who come to this special workshop meeting of the Lake Lord Town Council this Tuesday, March 26th. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And to begin with, I'd like you all to stand, please, for invocation and pledge of allegiance. Please bow your heads and pray with me. Heavenly Father, thank you for the many blessings you bestow on our community. As we gather here in public service to our town and its citizens, we ask for your divine guidance and wisdom to help us govern effectively, to do what serves the greater good and best interest of our citizens, and to be good stewards and guardians of this beautiful place we call home. In your name, we humbly ask these things. Amen. Amen. And if you would turn, we have a flag at the back of the room. I think it's a lot easier for us to see when we say the pledge. So let's say the pledge. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, and please be seated. And we'll begin our session as we always do with the adoption of our agenda. We have only one item of business, but I would accept any proposed revisions or changes to the agenda from our commissioners.
Mr. Mayor, before I move to adopt the agenda, could we ask that everyone turn off their cell phones or please put them on vibrate or the silent mode during the meeting?
Thank you.
And also, I make the motion that we adopt the agenda as presented.
We have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Cameron. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, that brings us to item 3, which is the one item on the agenda of business. Before I get into it, I'll do a little brief introduction, and I'm going to turn the entire program over to our engineering consultants who've been working on our dam, Schnabel. And I will have them introduce themselves, their team, and then go through a fairly extensive presentation. I understand they've prepared to kind of bring us all up to date on their findings and conclusions and recommendations. So before I do that, however, our town clerk has reminded me that what we'd like for everyone who has come here today, we have a sign-in sheet. And so we'd like for you to sign in so we kind of know who was here and who wasn't here. We've invited a number of folks from outside the community to come here. And we'd like to know after the meeting who we've had a chance to touch and who not, so we can follow up. So a sign-in sheet of each right here on the table. We'll have a period of, you'll see on our agenda, public comment. This will follow the presentation by our engineers, and I would ask the public who would like to ask questions primarily or comment on the presentations to hold off until that is the case. As it relates, this is a workshop for our town council, and the primary purpose of this is for us as town leaders and our town staff who are integrally involved in the dam and this project to have a chance really to come together with our engineers. And this is the first time since all of the studies have been completed that we've had a chance to actually sit and talk with them. So the main purpose of this meeting is a workshop, and I hope that we can conduct it that way. It is a public meeting, and for that reason, we do give the public a chance to ask questions and participate, but not until the presentation's over. As it relates to the rest of us up here at the table in the commission, I think I've done a number of these, both as a consultant and now as a town leader on the other side of the table. And I think the way that this has typically worked best for me is they're going to give their presentation in a series of segments. The logical progression of segments. And one thing I would ask, we can ask questions at any time. We're free to do that. But it would be, I think, efficient if we could wait till the end of a segment, their segment, so they get all the information out, and we're not asking something that they're about to answer. And we'll pause, I hope, at the end of each segment and have a little commission council Q&A. So with that, They're going to be giving a part of their presentation is a brief project background. I'm not quite sure, since I haven't seen it, what that will entail, but I will give a very quick recap on how we got to where we are today, because we started a long time ago on this journey. I say a long time ago. I believe it was back in October of 2016 when our town council voted to engage Marks Enterprises, the prior consultant, in a safety assessment of the dam. This is in response to inquiries, letters we got from the state Dam Safety Office asking that we perform such a detailed assessment. Dr. Marks worked on this project up until somewhere subsequent to May of 2018. He produced a number of studies, 2 phases of studies and some other reports. The major second phase study of his assessment was completed and turned over to us in February of 2018. And then between that time of February in 2018 and May, it was really in the hands of the state Dam Safety Office. They were reviewing his findings, and we were as well, looking over his reports. And in May of 2018, the Dam Safety Office issued a 10-page letter to us with their comments. And basically their comments were additional work is needed. And that was a conclusion I think we had come to internally, that in fact, with all the time and all the effort that had been put into those studies, they still, in my mind and in the state's mind, did not necessarily completely justify or support some of the recommendations and the findings that were in Dr. Marks's study. And so a lot of what they were asking for was additional information, additional studies, additional analysis, in order to get to a point where we could say definitively, this is the situation at the dam, and here's what you need to do about it to fix it. So at that time, I would say there was a fair amount of angst throughout our community and on our council about just exactly how bad was the dam in terms of its conditions, and what were the safety implications of that. And I think we have a much, much better understanding of that now, some whatever it was 18 months later or a year later, where we now have what I believe is an extremely detailed assessment of our dam using what I believe is the highest available technology in terms of computer modeling, investigations, the use of technology. And so I feel much better today about what we're about to hear, because I've seen these reports, and I don't want to be premature in congratulating the engineers, but from my seat, I think you did a very thorough job, and I hope maybe your presentation indicates that. Where do we go from here? I think you'll see, based on what I've seen in the presentation, there are some things that we're going to be able to go ahead and take action on. I mean, we must immediately. We're going to move ahead on. But there are still some things that, even in their detailed report, they indicate are going to need some more study before we can actually determine what the necessary or best renovations are to certain aspects of the dam, I guess. So with that, I will go ahead and I'll just introduce Jonathan Pittman from Schnabel Engineering. He is their project manager, and he has brought his team here today. All the key players, the people behind what you see in the studies here, what we'll see up here. And Jonathan, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you tell us what you know.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having us this morning. We appreciate the opportunity to be here. Mayor introduced me. I'll go ahead and introduce the rest. These are some of our key team members involved. This is certainly not everyone that's involved. We have about 35 folks in Greensboro specifically that focus on dams, and a lot of those folks aren't here today, but they were involved in this work. We also had several sub-consultants involved in this work, and we'll mention those folks as we go through the presentation and give them credit where it is due. Certainly is a great team. So just to introduce you to our folks here and who they are, Mark Landis here is he's our lead engineer for the project. Charles Johnson is our lead structural engineer. We've got Laura Sheeran-Fancher, she's our lead hydrology and hydraulics engineer. And then Sienna Kodai is our lead structural modeler. So we've tried to bring the key folks here today so that you can, if you have questions, you can ask those folks. I certainly am not the person to answer every question here. These are the experts in their respective fields. So with that, we'll get rolling. I mean, this really is a lot of ground to cover in a relatively short amount of time. So we've tried to keep it, some things relatively high level. Certainly if there are questions, we would be more than happy to answer the details associated with that. But just see if I can figure out how to work this thing. Maybe not. You'd think it would be up. Oh, there we go. It's down. That makes more sense. All right, so just to give kind of an outline of what we're going to cover, as the mayor said, we'll kind of start with a brief project background, and you've covered a lot of that already. And then we'll talk about what we were trying to accomplish overall, what was our scope, what were our objectives for this work. And then we'll go into, before we talk about the existing conditions assessment, which was the major piece of this work, we'll talk about some operational and emergency preparedness items that we are also working on and have assisted with, and some things the town has done. And then we'll dig into the big piece, the conditions assessment, talk through the information we reviewed to support that assessment, the investigations we did, the analysis we performed, and ultimately what we found. And then following that, we'll talk about what our recommendations are and kind of where you go from here. So just to give a brief background, obviously we're all here because the dam is owned and operated by the town, right? That's why we all care. But it's a large dam, about 124 feet tall at its maximum section. And it's what's called a concrete multiple arch buttress dam. And these aren't very common structures. It's quite a unique structure. It has a gated spillway section over there on the left abutment, obviously the tower, intake tower, and the powerhouse. Primarily it was constructed for hydroelectric and recreational purposes. It wasn't intended to be a flood control dam. Obviously most dams have some inherent flood control benefits, but that wasn't the purpose necessarily of this structure. It was designed by Mies and Mies out of Charlotte, and they were one of the, at the time it was built and designed, they were one of the premier engineers in this region. Shannon's got a really neat marketing pamphlet from them that shows a lot of their work. And it wasn't just dams, they did a lot of heavy civil type infrastructure work. So it was completed in September 1926, and you can see just a couple neat photos that were dug up, kind of what the area looked like prior to the dam, and then a photo shortly following construction. So obviously it was built in 1926. It wasn't built necessarily to modern dam safety standards, and I think that's an important thing to note. So it's currently regulated by North Carolina Dam Safety as a very large high hazard dam, and they break the dams down into sizes based on the height and the amount of water it impounds. So it goes from small, medium, large, very large. So very large is the largest category. And then high hazard, what that means is there are 3 hazard classifications: low, significant, high. And what that means is failure of the dam could potentially result in significant economic damage or loss of life, or loss of life. So that's how it's regulated, and based on that classification, there are certain design standards the dam must meet. There are certain standards it must meet for the design storm, for stability, and things like that. So the more critical the structure, the higher the hazard classification, the bigger it is, the more stringent those standards are, just due to the potential consequences should something happen with the dam. The dam, it's been around almost 100 years, and overall it has performed very well during its service life. It's met its intended purpose overall, has done very well, and that's documented in several reports throughout the life of the structure. So just a little bit, and I'm going to be careful not to go too far because I need to let Charles and Sina get into the details of this, but what these structures are, how they came about. They were pioneered by a gentleman named John Eastwood in the early 1900s. Most concrete multiple arch buttress dams are located on the west coast, California. But there are several on the east coast, including one not far up the road in Polk County, Lake Adger Dam. So these structures really, bottom right is a conventional concrete gravity dam. That basically, it's mass concrete. You use the weight of the dam to resist the forces of the water, resist sliding, that sort of thing. This is different, and the reason these structures, concrete multiple arch buttress dams, were built is because materials were very expensive back in that time, but labor was very, very cheap. So they said, well, how can we get rid of the majority of that concrete? Well, essentially what you're doing here is using the weight of the water to your advantage. So it's putting that entire arch system, the water's putting that in compression, and then that transfers all those forces into those buttresses that you see sticking out, which transfers it into the foundation bedrock. So it's a very well thought out, well designed system. The concept is sound, and they were, again, fairly common in the early part of the 20th century. None of these structures were built following World War II, and that's mostly because, a concrete gravity structure is a lot simpler to build, and when material prices go down, it made more sense to move to that kind of structure. So just a quick overview. I'm not going to talk through all this, but we'll be referencing different components that are shown on this slide throughout the presentation. I think one thing to point out, we're going to say left and right a lot. And when we say left and right, we're oriented looking downstream. So right is the lake operations building side, and left is the opposite side. Hopefully that will make sense as we go. We're not very good with north-south. We're better with left-right. But you can see here, it's a nice view. It gives you the bays are numbered, numbered 1 through 13 going left to right. So 1 through 3 are the gated spillway bays, and then 4 through 13 are the arch bays. You can see the elevation of the top of the arches varies. There's 3 different elevations. You've got the lowest elevation in 4 and 5 adjacent to the gated spillway. Then you've got the highest elevations in 6 through 8, which is directly upstream of the powerhouse. And then obviously you see the intake tower in the foreground. And you also have, I think Charles will mention a little bit, but there's 3 larger gates in bays 1 through 3, and then you've got a smaller trash gate in between bays 3 and 4. Here's just a view from downstream. So again, it's the left side is the right side of this picture, but bays number 1 through 13, and so get a feel for that. And you see the gated spillway bays, and then the arch bays with the powerhouse in bay number 7. So I think the mayor did a nice job of kind of saying how we got to where we are today. This is, following Mark's work, this is a couple pieces from the letter from North Carolina Dam Safety, May 2018. It's not all of the requests that were included in that letter, but these are the more significant ones. And so the the top 2 requests were, related to completing by August 1st, 2018, which is a pretty quick turnaround. The letter was asked for in May. And the impetus behind that was previous documentation, including from the Corps of Engineers and others, had indicated that the dam did not have adequate spillway capacity to pass the required design storm required by North Carolina Dam Safety. So that, North Carolina Dam Safety had that in their records, That's the only reference they had in their records. So they said we need to get an updated model to show, is that true? We need to revise that analysis. And two, an update to the emergency action plan for the dam. And what an emergency action plan is, and Laura's going to talk about it, but every high hazard dam in the state has to have one. And that's in the event of an emergency, what are defined roles and responsibilities for what you do at the dam, for evacuation downstream of the dam, emergency response, all that sort of thing. So that's a requirement for high hazard dams in the state. So the town had an existing one, and it did need updated. Then the next piece was complete by the end of 2018, which the first item is essentially investigate the upstream face of the dam. You don't see very often what's underneath the water, so let's take a look and find out what's down there. And then the second item is a 3D structural finite element model of the dam. And Marks had done some simplified 2D stability analyses, but it's, the state of the practice for these types of dams is to use the finite element model software, which is essentially just a 3D computer model, numerical model. And if Sina's our expert in this, if you really want to know the ins and outs of how finite element modeling works, he will gladly talk to you for quite some time about that. That's about as far as I can take it, that description. But anyway, that is the state of the practice. To look at a dam, that's the complexities. These structures are complex, much more complex than a gravity dam, like I showed before. So use that tool to evaluate the stability under a variety of different loading conditions, including flood loading, earthquake loading, that sort of thing. So we did that starting in about, September or so. We started to begin that work, and we'll talk through the specific scope. So overall, we had 2 task orders. We started with task order number 1. And what that entailed was most of these tasks, and we have 6 major tasks. One was meetings and project coordination, which covers kind of what we're doing here today. And that also, associated with that, was coordination with North Carolina Dam Safety. So up front, we met with the state dam safety engineer before we even started this work and said, do you agree with this scope? Is this what you're looking for? Is this appropriate? And they did, and we wanted to make sure we had that concurrence before we go down that road. And we've also met with them several times throughout this process just to, keep them up to speed on what's going on, where do we stand, do they have any questions. They came out, and about a month or so ago, Mark came out and met them out here and gave a brief tour of the dam. So we've kept them involved throughout the process to make sure they're aware of what's going on. And at the same time, we obviously, we were engaged in, I think, September, and some of those timelines in the original letter were either prior to that or not long after that, and we couldn't reasonably meet those timelines. And so we worked with them to come up with a revised schedule for submitting those documents, and they were agreeable to that. So just to go through the other tasks quickly, task 2 was reviewing available information wherever we could get our hands on that would help us understand the dam better, help support our analyses. Some site investigations, topographic and bathymetric surveys, so in-water survey and then land side survey to get a better understanding of the dam. Visual inspection, and then underwater investigation. We did a dive investigation of the upstream side, and we had a subcontractor support that, and also doing some geologic mapping to look at the exposed bedrock downstream of the dam, and we'll talk about why that was important. And then from the analysis side, the finite element modeling, which I already mentioned, and then we also looked at the potential for scour of that downstream bedrock. And then the red is task order number 2. So initially, that was not in our scope. Some of that had been started by Marks, and then we picked that up. But that's doing the hydrology and hydraulics, or H&H analysis, that the state had requested, looking at does the dam have adequate spillway capacity or not. Also updating the emergency action plan. And then another thing that was added on there was the spillway gate operations plan. So a document, and Laura will talk about a document to assist the town and provide some guidance for gate operations and management of lake levels for large storm events. And then task 5 is not a dam safety related task. We're looking at some potential modifications. What can you do to reduce kind of river tailwater levels a little bit to promote improved hydroelectric generation. And then 6 is just a summary of everything else. It's just kind of the final report. So I do want to mention this is not it wasn't a comprehensive evaluation, not every component of the dam. There are a few things we didn't assess in detail. For example, the intake tower, we did not perform a structural assessment of that component. We did not perform a detailed structural assessment of the spillway gates themselves. We didn't do there were some a little bit of geotechnical drilling that was done by Marks. We did not do any additional investigations of that nature. So we'll talk about some of those things and why they matter. So just real quickly, where do we stand on all this? Big picture, we've pretty much completed most of this work. The only items that are outstanding are obviously the meetings. We're still doing that today. And then the gate operations plan is still in progress. We're still working on that with the intent to complete that by the end of March, along with the tail race and outlet channel modifications work. But everything else related to the conditions assessment is complete, and we've provided deliverables to the town, some in final form, some in what we consider final draft form for review and comment. And then this is a summary of our deliverables, contract deliverables that we were providing. So the first one the big one is the condition assessment report. And what we did was we have a summary report that's relatively short. So if you're going to read something, read that to start. And then if you want to dig into the details, there are individual reports for each task. And they're included as appendices to that condition assessment summary report. So, visual inspection report, underwater investigation, a stability analysis report. And there's a lot more detail in those individual reports. The summary report is what it says. It's more of a summary. And then a few separate deliverables are the emergency action plan and the inundation maps that are associated with that, the gate operations plan, which I mentioned is still in progress, and then the tail race and outlet channel modifications report, which is also still in progress. But again, that's not really dam safety related. So this is, we did put a place in here kind of where we thought might be a good stopping point for the council to ask any questions you may have.
Anybody on our team have any questions?
Well, you mentioned a couple of things that were done by Dr. Marks, and no additional investigation was done. Is that because you reviewed his results and found them adequate, or you simply did not review that area?
We did review the work Dr. Marks did. We felt like for what's in general, for what our goals and objectives for this work, that we didn't necessarily need any additional, for example, geotechnical investigations at this time. Okay. Now we are saying one of our recommendations, if you move forward into subsequent phases, is to gather some additional information, but we felt like we had enough to support this condition assessment.
Okay.
One thing I would add to that, just Dr. Marks did attempt, I would say the right term is to deliver 2 of the requested studies that the Dam Safety Office in their letter. One was the H&H analysis, and the other one was the emergency action plan. Right. And quite frankly, the quality of the delivered documents was not adequate. And unfortunately, these consultants needed to, in essence, redo or do right. those 2 elements. And I think maybe that's what you had on your mind, and they had to go through it and redo it. That's what they've done.
We reviewed some of those, and I agree. I mean, some poor quality in some of them.
What I read through this was that there just was no supporting
no supporting evidence to support what his determination was. And obviously the state or anybody else is not going to accept
No.
that without some support.
He did, for example, he attempted to do a stability analysis without the H&H study, where he was not subjecting the dam to the design conditions that the state requires. He ran a 2D analysis on a very complex three-dimensional dam. Did not run the finite element analysis, and therefore he was not able to subject it, as Schnabel was now, to three-dimensional stresses working on the dam from a seismic event or the flood, right? And
Correct.
I don't think,
No, that's
am I
correct.
mischaracterizing?
No.
It was just, it was sort of a first order attempt to try to apply a bunch of assumptions to get to a quick conclusion, I think, or a speedy conclusion. And it was cost effective, but not effective really in what we needed. And so therefore the recommendations which he came up with even included cost estimates. Really were not, we couldn't depend on that. And the state would not accept that. And so that's how we got to where we are today.
Yep. Yeah.
Anything else? We're good.
Okay. So kind of before we jump into talking in more detail about the condition assessment work, I wanted to talk about some more operational and some emergency preparedness things. And the town, you all had a doozy of a 2018 in terms of extreme weather. Several storms, fire, right? Several big storms. So there's a lot going on. But talking specifically about Hurricane Florence and just kind of what occurred during that event. So the forecast, and this is, Laura found that's a real picture of Florence in the background. Can't see it real well, but the forecast for this area was somewhere in the order of about 15 inches of rainfall in 24 to 48 hours. So a lot of rainfall. And what the town did, and we kind of came on board right as this was going on, proactively drew down the lake about 7 feet to provide additional storage for that event. And we coordinated some with you on that and kind of where that drawdown lake level should be and where that made sense. And then I think regular emergency management meetings were held by your team in advance of the storm, throughout the storm, and then follow up as well. And then we were on site. I was actually the one here. We were on site 24/7 during the storm to provide, in terms of what we could. We didn't have a lot of engineering information at the time, but provide what guidance we could in terms of gate operations and lake levels. And we also were kind of a conduit to North Carolina Dam Safety during the storm event, just to say, hey, here's what's going on, here's where the lake's level's at, here's what's being done with the gates, just so they were aware. Because during a hurricane event, the dam safety folks have their hands full, and they have a lot going on. So any support, we can provide to them in terms of letting them know what's happening somewhere, they appreciate. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the town managed the gate operations to really control refilling of that 7 feet of storage, where by the end of the storm it was near the normal pool. One benefit there was that the rainfall was actually less than those forecasted, which was good. I will say I'm involved, and we're involved, and have been more so in the last few years due to Matthew and Florence and other storms. We get involved in this sort of thing pretty frequently, providing guidance to dam owners and storm events. I was extremely impressed by the coordination, the planning, the execution that the town put into this storm event. It was refreshing to see. Really, sometimes it's just a frantic shooting from the hip sort of reaction, and that was not at all the case here. So one thing, and we're going to talk about kind of a follow-up to this, some of the impetus for the gate operations plan was these storm events, is to, let's provide some guidance that will help the gate operations folks. Again, you have folks that understand those gates and the response to the lake way better than we do, but at least we can provide some engineering guidance to support and help make decisions related to those things. So now Laura's going to come up and talk briefly. I may have stolen some of her thunder, but talk briefly about the EAP and the gate operations plan.
All right, so to translate our speak a little bit, emergency action plan, it basically has two goals. The main is to help the owner with resources, procedures, information, contacts, things like that, so they can help protect the dam if there is an emergency. Then the other big piece is to provide information to the emergency responders downstream, so if there's an emergency, they know what areas could be impacted. So the town has a EAP currently that was developed in 1999, and it's been updated pretty frequently since then as people come in and out and phone numbers change and things like that. North Carolina released a standard EAP format around 10 years ago. And the intent with that is that format matches the North Carolina State Emergency Management structure. And the intent was to help it translate easier across jurisdictions. So we revised the town's current EAP to that format. And again, the intent is really so that when you say a level 2, that means the same thing to all communities involved. It's just a clarity thing, really. So what we did is we took a lot of information in that report, the previous EAP, translated it into the new format, and then we used the information from our hydrology and hydraulic analysis to update the inundation maps downstream, so we have current information in case of evacuations and road closures and things like that. And really the next step after that is to meet with those involved in an emergency, so the town staff and then the downstream communities, and just make everyone familiar with that current format so everyone knows what's going on. The next thing, as Jonathan said, is we're looking at a gate operations plan, and it is in progress, so I don't have quite as much information. What we've done so far is we met with a lot of the town staff involved with that in February. We talked about, I think it was about 2 hours, it was a decent-sized meeting, about what is currently their operations, what information they have that they like, what other sources of information that would make their lives easier, other tools that could be useful, things like that. And so the plan's intent will be to help clearly define what are the priorities and the goals of the gate operations plan, make sure who does what is clearly defined, and then provide those resources and tools that would be helpful in an emergency or really just any time the gates need to be operated, just so those decisions can be made a lot easier. I think, yeah, we have a question break now.
Questions?
I've got one regarding the proactive drawdown here in Florence of the 7 feet. And as it relates to either additional stress or less stress on the dam, and in conjunction with the damage it does to our shoreline by doing that. And I understand that protection of the property is probably a little more or a lot more important than our shorelines, things that can be repaired. But in your investigation, did you find that to be reasonable or something we shouldn't have done, or did you agree with it?
Yeah, it's certainly reasonable. We talked through it. I think one of the first conversations the mayor and I had was talking about, is 7 feet, or we're at 3 feet, or is 7 feet okay? Should we go a little further? What makes sense? So we agreed that 7 feet was appropriate and reasonable. Really, if you get a major storm event, if you had gotten 15 inches of rainfall, that 7 feet goes pretty quick. So, it provides some relief and some storage. I think it was appropriate. Again, you have to kind of manage the risks associated with the potential for have to make some post-storm adjustments to the shoreline versus protecting the dam. And that's certainly there's a balance there based on the forecast and that sort of thing.
In the establishment of the emergency action plan, is there any kind of criteria there saying if you get a prediction of more than 12 inches of rain in a certain time frame, any kind of a model out there that we can use to sort of judge that drawdown by, or do we play it by ear in every situation?
Yeah, so the intent of, it actually won't be in the emergency action plan, but the intent, that's part of the intent of the gate operations plan, is to provide guidance on if you have this, you're expecting this kind of event, here's some guidance on how you should respond, how you should prepare for that event.
Oh, thank you.
I would think that developing our model and doing the models of events, possible events, would be what we would use to make those determinations about drawdown and things like that.
Correct.
Because you couldn't use another dam that might be 4 times the size and don't have the same watershed runoff and all those things.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And one thing Laura's going to talk about it, but the model she developed was calibrated to these storm events, along with some other ones. So it's, sometimes you look at these hydrology and hydraulic models and say, wonder how accurate that is. Well, what we were able to do was take real events and calibrate our model to those events so we have a high confidence level in the model that can be used to support, multiple different things.
The things I read through were pretty impressive with, how much comes from this stream, different things like that. It was pretty impressive, I have to say.
Yeah, well, that's all Laura.
I understand.
One question for you. At what point, how many feet can we draw it before we start actually having a detrimental effect on the dam? Or do you got to keep so much down low you want it down and realize it? How many feet can we draw down before it starts being detrimental to the dam?
That's good. I don't know that I have the specific question. I mean, you can draw it, the most you can draw it down is about 16 feet without putting pumps in the lake or some other diversion method, right? That's
my concern there was just the downloading. You got to keep some of it down low you want it.
correct. So
it's designed, so at what point are we damage the dam instead of helping ourselves?
right. And I don't know that we've analyzed it closely, but maybe Sina can answer that.
Yeah, the dam by itself is stable. Even the water has two sort of basically forces. It has one element that pushes dam downstream, and then another has that basically that pushes dam down. But without the water, the dam is still stable. So we don't have any worries about the full drawdown, or it will not have any effect on the stability. That's the first step that I did. So I will explain it.
Yeah.
We always prefer actually that if we went down so far, we reduced too much of that downforce, and now we're actually detrimental to the entire.
I think one of the comments that we had heard related structurally wasn't so much the amount of drawdown, it was the timing, how fast that's done. Because
Correct.
when you draw down, you're eliminating stress on the dam that flexes, the arches flex, right? And if you do that too quickly or rebound too quickly, I imagine that has some impact, right, on how well the dam reacts to that?
Usually, in our assumption, that the really quick one that flexes is that an earthquake event. Which we usually don't put it earthquake during flooding. That would be just a way to, possibility for like, that's basically the end of time. If there's an earthquake on top of it, so usually in our when the lake is on a normal flow on a sunny day, usually we have the earthquake come. That's the more possible, probable timing for the extreme event.
So there's no worry about how fast.
No, there's no worries usually about drawdown.
Okay, because that was the second part of the
A couple of things I'd like to add. I think it was exceptionally valuable, not that we got a hurricane, but that we had the opportunity to have our engineers in the trenches. You know, you use that term often, but that was really where they were. I mean, they were sitting there in lake operations. As the levels were coming up and the rain was coming down and the forecast was dire, they were there with us. They saw the dam operate. They saw how the lake responded to the storm event. And what Jonathan didn't mention, he was there 24/7 with another engineer or a technical person.
Yeah, he was an engineer.
Schnabel, and they were frequently on the phone with Laura, who was running kind of quickie, right, hydrologic calculations to determine if you open the gate another foot, how much water are we gonna be able to discharge. The other thing I wanted to say about that particular hurricane event, because I was in the trench with them, and that was a very, it was a real problematic storm in terms of the storm track. That storm was forecast to come right up through the downstream discharge area of our lake, the river. If that had happened, which to some extent it did, it took an earlier turn, but had it come up through that watershed, all the areas in which we were discharged would have been flooded well before we discharged. And that is the reason why, when we made the call, and it was Dr. Marks was involved in that, to drop that lake 7 feet, it had as much to do with the track and the timing of the storm and our trying to avoid making a really bad situation a lot worse by holding back the water and then discharging it when the storm actually hit our area into an area that was already inundated and flooded. And so, going back to what Jonathan said, although the dam itself was not designed to be a flood control structure, we can do things and how we operate it that mitigates some of that, and that is exactly what we were trying to do in that storm.
I think that was an excellent choice, and it's a balance, because what happens is we first get the downstream people concerned with flooding, and then we get our people here, so on the boats hanging in free air right now. So we're trying to balance both of those, but number one's the safety of, I agree, I mean, anytime we should be able to draw down and act as a buffer to control that water going out. That's common sense 101, and we've got to get that through to our community, because the community doesn't totally understand those hydraulics. And I mean, we're a basin. We're actually the silk basin for the whole mountain region, the whole gorge from Hendersonville this way. So
95 square miles.
right. So no, we have that opportunity. We need to drop it anytime we think it's even possible to have issues.
So one thing to add to that is rapid drawing, like we're talking about, it's not good for hurricanes. You can have slush. What you demonstrated by going 7 feet, though, we didn't have any damage to the abutments or slides that could have occurred from rapid drawdown. You still have floor pressure in the slopes.
Okay.
If they're not draining as fast as the water goes down, then you could have slides into the reservoir. So 7 feet is probably we know that works. I don't know if we want to be going a lot more than that, because we don't know, like the wing wall, for instance, on the left side, if it's charged with water and the water goes down below it, then all that water level that cannot drain could possibly fill the wing wall.
See, that's what my concern for, where should we stop? You're saying 7 feet is really, once we start dropping below there could be issues, or there is.
So we haven't looked at that, but I'm saying we've already proved that 7 feet
Right.
is not
Is
going
okay.
going more than that. We probably will.
Well, we had it lower than that in 2016. But I mean, it down to almost 11 feet, if I recall. But I've never seen it in 25 years I've lived on the lake. I've never seen it drop as fast as it did for that 7 feet. And that was my concern. and the speed of that drawdown.
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah.
Couple things. In our conversation with Dr. Marks, when we were trying to come up with a plan in preparation for the storm, some of his recommendations were actually lower than 7 feet. And I think some numbers, calculations were sent. I think the mayor quickly saw that some of those calculations were not accurate. And so then we went to say, hey, let's pick up the phone, let's call Schnabel, let's get a second opinion. And it was from that phone call that we started to say, all right, we're going to change horses, and we're going to go with this group. And they came, and as the mayor pointed out, were able to work with us real time on some of the modeling, and they also were in close contact with Donnie and the operators. But in all that teamwork we came up with, I believe, was the right approach. One of the questions I'm going to ask tomorrow is about our watershed. What are some unique things you learned about our watershed?
Ooh, that's actually my section.
Okay.
She's going to cover that.
One observation, Jonathan, and I don't know the answers for you to this, but I think back to 94, 95, when we brought the lake down, the maximum we could take it down was 16, 17 feet in order to dry out. You know, we dried out and brought in hands, big trucks, and track loads and everything to get the silt out that had come from hurricane, whichever one of those hurricanes, some nice lady. But do we have any of those records from that then that might be of help in that? That was a planned drawdown, and we did it over a length of time.
Right.
But that's the only time since I've lived here, 28 years, that we've ever come close to being down. We went down to 14 feet, one of it, 11.
I think that was after the 96 flood.
Yeah. But, I don't know if there's any records anywhere that might be of help to y'all with that. We stayed down that whole winter while they took out the silt and stuff that was here that came in from Hurricane Hugo, maybe, I don't remember. Fran, maybe, it was later than you.
Right.
Anyways, that's just the thought.
Yeah, I don't think we have it, but certainly anything would be helpful. The main thing typically is that it's done at a controlled rate, so those, the pressures can kind of equalize with the lower lake level. So typically you target about a foot a day is the typical target. Sometimes it can go a little more rapidly, sometimes not. It depends. Again, the short, kind of the reservoir rim is, you can get the same sort of thing happening there. So it's just important for the reservoir rim as well. You don't want to draw it down too fast or you get a slide, somewhere up in the lake. So.
A lot of times you don't have that many days to drop it.
Yeah.
A major storm.
We did in that story.
Exactly, this one was a good example, but it was a matter of just a day or two and you had to drop it to 7 feet, so.
Yeah. The foot is, that's kind of a recommend. It's not it's got a rule of thumb, but it's certainly not you must stick to this.
Okay, we're good.
All right. All right, so we're going to roll into kind of the existing conditions assessment portion of the presentation. I promise you'll hear less from me starting in a couple of minutes and more from other people. But so what we did, we tried basically, to us, historic information is gold. I mean, it's invaluable. If you ever find something on the dam, please don't throw it away, because this stuff is, some things people think may not be useful or are typically useful. And one of those things, so we went around, basically met with the town, went to local libraries, met with Mike Smith over here in the Asheville Regional Office of DEQ and reviewed their files, tried to get our hands on as much information as possible. And Dr. Marks had also done quite a bit of research there, and we were able to use some of that. But just to go through what we did, construction photographs was the first thing, and these really are, I love looking at these old photographs. And Isothermal Community College actually had about, I think it was 44 of these old construction photographs and delivered them to the town. We took those, we had those scanned and then return scan copies to the town. And so we reviewed those, and what we were really looking at is construction details, how things were done, how the dam was built, and they were, obviously there's always a photograph you would love to have that you don't have, but they were certainly helpful. Construction drawings are, those are typically the best thing. It shows us exactly how the dam, at least it should have been built. Unfortunately here, there are pretty limited drawings available. The drawings that are available are primarily show the bridge, the spillway gates, and the powerhouse. But there's not a whole lot of detail on the dam itself, the arches, the buttresses. So we were able to use those and get some good information, but unfortunately it's not the full set, and we have not been able to track that down to date. But what we were able to do is, I mentioned Lake Adger Dam earlier. It was designed by the same firm, Mies & Mies, built right at about the same time, and it's a very similar, it's concrete multiple arch buttress dam. So we did review all that information. We got that from DEQ and relied on some of that. Obviously there's some assumption there that the details are the same, but we did use some of that information to support, so it was nice to have. And then in terms of reports, we looked at the Corps of Engineers did what they call phase 1 inspections of pretty much most dams in the country back in the late 70s, early 80s. And so these are a general safety assessment of the dam is what was typically performed. Overall, that indicated, the dam is in good condition, but it did, as I mentioned before, say that the dam does not have adequate capacity to pass the design storm, which is the PMP, or probable maximum precipitation. So again, that's the report Dam Safety had in their files that they were referencing that we need an updated model here. A firm, DTA, out of Charlotte, they've since changed names, but they did some inspections in 2006, 2007. Overall, they found the dam to be in good condition. Some items of note you see there. There was an earthquake in 2007, not a California earthquake, but East Coast earthquake. And so they came out and looked at, and I don't remember the magnitude or anything of that, but 3.1, so relatively small. And they came out and looked at the dam, noted some increased leakage, but really no structural distress. Now, they did recommend a structural analysis of the dam at that time, but there are no records that that analysis was performed following that. Some additional documents we reviewed, and these are the main ones. This is not a comprehensive list of everything, but Clifton, who's currently still working for the town, providing support for the hydroelectric work. And I will mention now, we're focused on the dam and the dam safety aspects, but you can't completely separate the dam and the hydroelectric operations because some of the components have a dam safety aspect to them. So we did review those documents. Charlie Merrick was extremely helpful to us throughout this process, answer any questions we might have. I don't know if he's here today or not, but he provided a lot of assistance to us, and it was great. So the penstock, he did a corrosion survey back in 2015 and noted some, not widespread corrosion, but some severe corrosion in localized areas. And as a result of that, there was some reinforcement of those areas that was done, and also some additional investigations that were recommended. And some of those investigations have been performed, some have not. And then Charles will reference some of this stuff in his section, so I'm not going to steal all his thunder. But we didn't do the bridge. Obviously, we'll talk some about the bridge. It's a bridge, not a dam, but it's on the dam. So we did look at it and consider it in our work. And we looked at the latest DOT inspection report, and they consider that bridge to be functionally obsolete just because it doesn't meet their geometric requirements. But also that it's in poor condition, and Charles will show some pictures of that, so I'm not going to go into detail there of what we saw at the bridge. But our observations were generally consistent with the DOT's, though their inspection was much more comprehensive. The gate hoist and the intake tower, again, Charlie and his group looked at that. as you know, I think the gate hoist is really in poor condition, non-functional, and you're looking at rehabilitating or replacing that. And then we've talked about Mark's work in 2016 through 2018. Again, we were not able to rely on a lot of this, but we did use some of it, such as the foundation drilling and concrete coring that was done to help support our analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles, and he's going to talk through the site investigation part of what we did. And once we go through the site investigation stuff, we'll stop for questions before we talk about the analyses.
All right, so here's the list of the site investigations that we did. It was basically surveys, inspections, and some mapping of the geology. We worked with local surveyor Ed Holmes and Associates, and this was basically to supplement the original as-built drawings of the dam. You know, you had a number of drawings, but we didn't have a complete set that was enough information for us to actually know how thick the arches are and how they vary with height. And so basically what they did is go upstream and scan underwater and then do the same thing downstream and on land. And so they'd have these surfaces that they would stitch together, and when you combine those, you can develop a model of what the dam actually looks like. I don't know. Down or up's not working. You mind pushing for me?
It's probably right. Point it this way. There you go.
There you go.
All right.
Just
Shoot this in.
probably.
All right, thanks. So here's one of those sections that was created through one of the arch bays. So this is cut, the reservoir's on your left, downstream is to the right. And so from this, we were able to see what how the arch varies from top to bottom. And that dashed line that I've noted as apparent sediment beyond, we realized that when they, scanned upstream, they were seeing very large, very thick areas where the two arches come together at a buttress. And so sediment, as it comes into the reservoir, it was kind of dropping down and kind of working its way to those valleys in between the buttresses. So that was one thing we wanted to look at when we get to the underwater inspection. This is from the downstream side looking back upstream at a typical bay. And so in many of these bays, you would see water streaking down through the horizontal joints from where the concrete was placed in subsequent lifts. And so that's very common, and it may vary from seasonally as this dam expands and contracts. And you can see water streaming down over on the picture on the right, even in the vertical joints where the arches tie into the buttresses. And so we went back and looked at, even during construction, even before the powerhouse was built, we found this photo that shows the leakage occurring even at that time, where it's kind of, draining down the concrete face there. Now, if you actually had, with 100 plus feet of head, if you actually had a, good size opening, you'd see water shooting out like a, fire hose. So these are pretty tight, but over time it does, do some damage to the concrete and can weather it down. One of the previous reports I noted from, I think, back in 2007, following the earthquake, there had been a diagonal crack noted in one of the buttresses, and so we found at least one other bay that had a similar crack. And so at this point, we're just saying you need to keep an eye on that. If you notice, the crack continues to open or propagate downstream, that's something we want to be aware of. But there's other questions we had associated with that, like, is there rebar that would, arrest this crack and keep it closed? And so one of the things that we did, and was actually required by dam safety, is we went through in a few spots and we did some ground penetrating radar, which in crude terms is like x-raying the concrete to see if you can find a sign of rebar. And what we found in this location that was easily accessible, we found that there was rebar within the top 12 feet or so of the buttresses, and then it stopped. It didn't go all the way down to the bottom. And that was pretty consistent with another set of drawings that we had found from Lake Adger Dam in the area that we talked about earlier. We also looked in the arches. The picture at the top left is down at the very bottom of the arch, and then also at the top in one of the very short bays, and did not find any indication of rebar in either of those areas. And so Sina's going to talk a little bit later about the implications of what that means structurally for the dam. Now we did, as we followed down the corbel, this photo at the right is the corbel where the arch ties into the buttress, and in some areas we were actually able to see exposed rebar in there. So I guess that's a good sign that, hey, yes, there is rebar that does go all the way down to the bottom of the concrete anyway, but it's only on the upstream side where the corbel is what we have found. When we went out on a boat and took a look at the upstream side, several of the arches had vertical cracks at different locations, as you go around the arcs, they'd be in different locations. And so that was one thing that we were wondering what the extent of those cracks is. And when we went back and did the underwater inspection, we would track those down, and typically they only went about 5 feet or so below the water surface before they would, stop. We found one area in particular that had what we'll call pattern cracking, but it's basically this random kind of map cracking. And I guess the concern with that is oftentimes this is evidence of, if you have a certain type of aggregate, you have a certain type of cement, and you mix in water, which you typically do with dams, then you can get this gel that will form over time. And it may happen after 20 years, it may happen after 100 years. So it's something to be aware of. But when this gel expands, it can crack apart the concrete. And so that was one thing we were looking for in particular. And the good news is we've only found that in this one particular area at the top of one of the arches. Now we took a look at the bridge, not nearly as detailed as the NCDOT did when they came in and shut down the road and used specialized trucks to get underneath the, look at every single girder under the bridge. But we did review their report and took some photos of that. And so there were transverse cracks that you can see on the top side. There were previous concrete spall repairs that had been patched and would need to be ongoing to address. There were numerous spots of observed, even from standing down on the ground 100 feet down. You can see several spots where there's spalls, where the rebar has corroded over time and it'll spall off that top coat of concrete. So in some areas, there was enough section loss that the DOT had come back and, I guess, derated the bridge or brought down its load loading capacity. The one thing I would point out here that's of particular interest to us is not something that we could find from the construction drawings or from these visual inspections, is how do these concrete beams that are sitting on top of the buttresses that form the dam, how are they connected? And so, there's intended to be a expansion joint in several of these bridge sections so that they can move longitudinally. And, that's pretty apparent. But if you were to get, say, an earthquake, then what happens in that instance? Is there some sort of connection that's buried within the concrete? We don't know for sure, but, one of the things we had recommended is just kind of cheap insurance, is putting some kind of steel brackets to sandwich around the concrete beam so that it can't move relative to the buttress upstream or downstream, and still would allow it to, expand and contract seasonally. Here's a picture at one of the right abutments, so basically where the end of the bridge over near the lake house side. It's really hard to see, but there are 2 round steel roller pins underneath this concrete beam, and there's also a horizontal, let's see if this works. These are the roller pins here, and here is a bearing plate at the bottom of the concrete, a steel bearing plate. So there's a lot of heavy corrosion there where you can see the steel rust delaminating. And so here is a picture of Bay 13 towards the end of one of the inspections. It got a little bit of rainfall, and you could see that water was starting to pond up downstream of arch number 13. So this is all standing water just from local runoff. And so when that water gets up high enough, it spills back over upstream into the reservoir. And as it does so, it's kind of done some weathering over the years. And so putting in a little bit of drainage to get rid of that surface water would extend the concrete life there. And it's not often that you get to see animals in their animal burrows at these dams, but saw this guy up at the top of the access stairs there. So here, jumping back to the survey, this is a section through the gated bays, and so right here is one of your Tainer gates. One thing I would point out from this survey is if you look at the upstream side, there's what appears to be steps as you go up, and so we were able to see that during the visual inspection, but that also can give a good indication of how the dam was built in subsequent lifts as they go up. There's probably a construction joint at each of those locations. So here's a picture from the reservoir looking downstream at one of the Tainer gates. In several of the gates, there was some vegetation starting to accumulate, actually growing within the Tainer gates. I know it's difficult to access, but that's something you'll want to, get rid of so it doesn't so it doesn't damage the gates, but also so you could better see any signs of distress. This is fairly common for the time, but there is no embedded steel or metal plate in the pier. This is just your gate rubbing up against concrete. So over time, that concrete kind of deteriorates, and if you approach this dam from the downstream side, you'll see a lot of leakage on the chutes, even when the gates are closed. And so that's just because you're losing some water from the seals. There's also these tie-back rods that tie back the gate itself. So the gate's anchored to the pier right here, and then there's these embedded rods that also have bearing plates that are embedded in the concrete. So the concrete appears to be wearing off some there. They still appear to be well painted, and no major corrosion that we observed, but that's something to keep an eye on. Here's a up-close photo of one of the gates, and so typically around the water line, if you look real close here, you see all these little dots that are basically pits, corrosion pits in the gate. And so, we didn't do any, that's about as close as we got to the gates, and we didn't do any structural analysis of the gates. But the good news is that this is typically at the top of the gates where your water load is much less than it is down at the bottom. But that's something you want to keep an eye on and make sure this doesn't start, corrode all the way through your skin plates or cause structural issues. So this top series of 3 photos here is from another dam in another state that built exactly the same year as Lake Lure Dam. And it also has Tainer gates, just like Lake Lure Dam has. And one other defining feature of that was very common at the time is these, I'll call them loop welded anchor rods. So where the gate, this is your gate here, where it ties into the pier, there would be a anchor rod which loops around. And oftentimes the way these things were formed is they were, start with a straight bar and heated up, and it's forged, it's looped around and then forged back together. And so over time, there's inherently a little bit of a weak plane. And so over time, that can turn into a crack and propagate. And in this case, in another dam, they'd propagated all the way to failure where that anchor rod had completely separated. So Lake Lure has anchor rods that are at least the same configuration. Now, we don't know for sure exactly how it was created. And kind of the good news and the bad news about your anchor rods that you have is that they're embedded in the concrete. So there's some confinement of the concrete in place should that anchor rod split apart. But on the other hand, you can't see what the condition of that anchor rod is without chipping out a little bit of concrete to see what its condition is. So that's one of the things we suggested taking a look at just to be sure that's not an issue. Now, I went down into the powerhouse and took a look at the previous, these markings that you see. That was from the Clifton Corporation's previous corrosion survey. And so they had some skin plates that were installed based on their recommendations. And it's kind of hard to see from here, but there's just a couple little tack welds where it was welded to the penstock. And in some cases, those weren't bonded. Those had either separated or didn't, weld to begin with. And so if you were to get an actual leak in there, then you'd have water squirting out all around. So we recommended going back and, sealing, doing a continuous seal weld all around those plates. This is a picture of the downstream side, downstream of the powerhouse and the tail race, where currently your primary access to the left side, over to the gated bays on the downstream side, is across the sewer pipe with this plank walkway. And I understand you're looking at some long-term options for getting access over there, but just as a short-term measure, one thing we'd recommended is extending those planks the last 10 feet or so, just so you're not having to walk on this slippery pipe for the last few feet. And so if you follow that sewage pipe all the way up to the downstream side of the dam, here's a sewage pipe where it ties in. And we understand that there's been some leakage observed, and that's one thing we're going to go take a look at after today's meeting to see if there's anything that needs to be addressed there. But at the time, of our inspection back in October, there was standing water there, but there's really not positive drainage from that area to say, how much of this is due to, from leakage through the joints or seepage under the dam or from leaks in the sewer pipe. So anyway, that's something we're going to take another look at today. The propane tank was installed next to one of the buttresses. So, of course, if that tank exploded, that's not something you want right next to your dam. And so DEQ had already required that be moved well away from the dam, and you guys have already taken care of that, and that's moved, so that's no longer of concern. Back in November, we went back out for a week and did a series of dives. We had a 17 dive crew, and we looked at the upstream and downstream sides of the dam underwater. And some of the things that we weren't able to see very well, or almost impossible to see, even in, with leaves off the trees. If you look very closely, you can see that there's a crack hidden behind all that foliage. And so one of our recommendations is, of course, to, get that foliage off so that you can take a good look at that crack. But we were able to find it pretty easily underwater and tracked it down as far as it went, which, I don't know, I want to say it was like 10 feet or so below the water line. But again, the significance of these cracks is something that we're taking into consideration with the structural analysis. We took a look at the Tainer gates, and so this photo on the left, you can see a chain up at the top that goes all the way up to the gate operator platform. So this diagram on the right side, that's basically your gate looking downstream. Here's that same chain, and when it gets just underwater, it splits into two wire rope cables that go all the way down and are connected to the gate here. So there's a lot of fittings and in some of the, I think 2 of the 3 gates, they were showing a pretty decent amount of wear. It's not something that's, of immediate concern, but, moving forward, that's something that we had suggested that you replace those fittings. This is often the most susceptible part of the gate. If you lose these connections and aren't able to lift the gate, then the gate's useless during a flood. Down at the bottom of the gate, so again, this is a detail from the original construction drawings. Here's your gate, your reservoir is over here on the left. But where they sit on the top of this concrete dam is there's a little wooden block there that was part of the original construction. And we were able to find these wooden sills that run all the way across the bay. And where it meets the concrete, in some areas, we could see that water was flowing down underneath the sill. So that's coming down here, going underneath the wooden block, and then daylighting back upward on the downstream side and spilling down the OG chute. So there's leakage under that wooden sill. And I guess at some point, if you lose enough bond between the wood and the concrete, that you could lose that wooden block altogether, and it'd be very difficult to seal. One of the things that we observed on the upstream side of the dam, particularly in the gated bay area and also at the base of the intake tower, was they just left in place a lot of wooden formwork. I think they got towards the end of the job and maybe we were running out of money and just said, well, we'll just leave this in place. So that meant that these areas were not very easily inspectable to us. Now this is a photo downstream underneath the powerhouse. And so these turbines, there's 2 turbines in there now, and they discharge water straight down into the tail race underneath the powerhouse building. And so over time, that water, as it hits the rock, it's kind of scoured it or weathered it away. And in some areas, what I would call pretty minor undermining, but enough that you can stick your hand under there. And so that's not something that you want to let continue on long enough that you're losing support for your powerhouse building, which is not going to happen, in the next, it's not going to happen today. But it's a lot easier to take care of these things before they become much bigger. It's a lot cheaper to take care of these things before they become much bigger issues. This is over at the left side, this is a plan view. So you're looking down from above on the powerhouse building. And right here is this 7-foot wide tunnel that we understand was used for stream diversion to pass water during the original construction. And down here at the bottom, this is a section. So you're looking at the tunnel. You would head straight into that tunnel. We did look into that tunnel as far as we could go, and with the dive team safely, and we did find one crack in there, but we weren't able to track that crack as far back as we wanted to go. And so one of our follow-ups to that is we suggest sending in a remotely operated vehicle, so we're not putting any divers at risk going around bends with their umbilical cords, but just to take another look at that. And then the last piece of this is we did some geologic mapping of the exposed rock. And so this was used to inform the scour analysis of the downstream side and the stability analysis of the dam. This is the left wall. If you're looking downstream, this is the left wall that you can see kind of how the concrete from this red line up, that's all concrete, and it's sitting on the existing bedrock, which was horizontally bedded. That's what these joints are showing. And we took the rock cores that had been performed recently and we shipped off a couple of these samples so that we could get some material strength test results on them. And here's a picture of one of the crushed samples. In general, the rock compressive strength was, it varied quite a bit, but it was still, even at it's the weakest we tested it was still about double the concrete compressive strength. So relative to the concrete, it's a bit stronger. at least where it's intact. And that's all we had on the site investigations. Turned over to questions.
Questions?
Where this wood is at the top where the water's infiltrating through, would you recommend the repair there be a rubber membrane or epoxy? How would you recommend sealing that to eliminate that problem?
I guess it depends on how frequently you want to deal with this. You know, if you want to take the short-term fix, you know, patching some kind of grout in there could take care of that. If you wanted to have a reduced leakage, if that was the goal, then putting in some kind of embedded steel plate there that your gates have a nice flush contact to, then that's, you know, kind of a higher end fix. But to do substantial repairs in that area now, one of the things you need to consider is, you know, are you willing to drop the lake in order to do substantial repairs in the dry? Or if not, then you currently don't have like a bulkhead or some type of system that you could install upstream of the gate that would allow you to then pump the water out between that bulkhead and the gate.
Fortunately, you want to drop your lake every 3 years anyway, so it would be a scheduled repair. It's just, you know, in wood will continue to deteriorate, so fix it, keeps it, once to be done with it.
How low or how far down underwater are those?
I'd say around 20. Where the sills are.
The top of the container gate is basically that 16, 17 feet that you can draw down. So you can,
17, 16 feet?
yeah.
16, 17 feet.
With all the,
Yeah.
And if that happened, how long are you thinking that kind of repair would take?
I don't want to say that at this point.
At least it depends a lot on how fast we made the money available and wanted it to happen. That was a big part of it, but not something we would want to do and draw out for months and months, obviously.
If you drew the lake down and you do it in the dry, you could work on all three at the same time. Versus what he's talking about, bulkhead, you gotta move the bulkhead to each bay. And that'll float on. But you won't the bulkhead is gonna be very expensive.
Is it not anything that you could pump in hydraulics and then around it?
Possibly, I may, you know, putting in some sort of rags or something just enough to slow the leakage. Otherwise, it's going to be pumping it. I feel like. It's probably some sort of.
So is there a significant amount of leakage that's going through that now, you think, that's going on the downstream side?
You can go back to the aerial, because it's a long way back.
Which aerial?
Okay.
You want me to go back to the,
The wood and steel.
oh, the aerial. Right. Doing a lot of clicking. Coming.
You passed it.
yeah.
Other way there.
There you go.
So that's the gates closed, and it's on the shore here.
The trash chute is open here, but it's only half that.
Yeah.
So there's that, you see that stream here, the
Oh,
third
you're
day.
saying around the tank gates, that's the
Yeah.
amount, with them closed, that's the amount of water that's
One
going.
and two. One and two is pretty good as well.
Right.
So
That's,
that wood
that's
is
leakage.
part of that, of the tank gates, where that wood is
It's
embedded.
not a part of it, it's where it sits on.
Right.
Seats.
I mean, again, the other piece of that is your side seals that are just rubber and concrete, that's not
Right.
real water tight seal.
That's because of the plate not being there,
But you get leakage at the outlet sides.
Correct.
Well, now, since there are no plates there, I mean, could they be installed at this point in time? Or you would have to reduce the size of the gate to fit within it, I guess, if you put weights on it.
Yeah, you'd have to, I think the gate out of place, the wide gate, I don't know off the top of my head how far you'd be able to get that gate open, if you can get it open all the way. But again, is one of the questions for you guys is losing water, is that enough concern to justify the cost?
Yeah, well, Jonathan, you might want to bring up, I think there's another point to this as well, because the whole design of the gate system, as it relates to our ability to pass the design flood, isn't that still under consideration? Are we looking down the road at possibly redesigning that system to increase the hydraulic capacity of the dam?
You could, I think, in general, the size storm, due to the extent of the size of the design storm, it's not going to make a difference. You can't put a gate system in there that will allow you to pass that. So, I mean, these are good gates. It's a good system, but they require some maintenance and upgrades.
David Airwood just reminded me that it's a requirement that we release 9 million gallons a day. DEQ, this is mandates that we do that for
Oh, the downstream environmental
and also
issue. Yeah.
wastewater treatment.
Uh-huh.
So there's a minimum amount that we have to release in order to stay in standards with DEQ regarding this.
So it's really not hurting us that we're losing, where that water's getting through, it's meeting the requirements, I guess, we have to look what that's through that stream.
I think a lot more water's going through our sewer than it is coming out of that gate.
I mean, maybe it doesn't hurt to release the water, but what impact does that have on the operation of the gates over time? Is that going to affect them in a negative way? Leakage?
With the gates themselves, I can't think of how that would necessarily cause an issue unless you've lost enough concrete that your gates are able to move around or you're starting to jam up your gates. So I guess it's possible, yes, at some point that could become an operational issue for the gates.
Just looking at them, that's a perfectly flat surface, right? Where they're sealing down, supposed to seal down. How thick is that? A couple of feet wide or 18 inches wide?
It's an 8 or 12 inch wide timber.
Immediately think all you do is take a piece of angled steel, come down and maybe extends down both sides by a foot or 8 inches or whatever.
Cap.
There's a cap right on, and sit on top of that and bolt it in place. You can even install a seal on top of that. That's why I'm thinking just right off the bat is just put I call it horseshoe, just put a flat piece of steel on top of that, extend it down far enough that it can be anchored.
Is that the only wooden seal there is, just that one?
No, 3 gates.
3 gates.
Four. Yeah. And is there only one of them that's a problem, or all 3 of them have a problem?
There's at least 2 of them that have these localized where we could physically see water.
And the third one's probably not far behind now.
Yeah.
And then we'll see what we need to do is cap it or something. That'll give you a new surface for that gate to come down and seal.
Possibly so. Any questions? Yeah?
Well, yeah, a little bit, somewhat of a different direction. In the previous report, we had that there was water going under the dam. Have you found that to be true or not?
I don't know that we can say for sure. I mean, it's natural for water to be able to work its way underneath the dam, where the rock is cast on top of the bedrock. That's called a preferential leakage path where water can work its way through. You see it above water. You go downstream, you see the concrete placed against concrete, and water naturally works its way through those pre-existing joints.
Oh,
That's not unusual.
That,
was made to sound like it was a significant problem with water going into the dam. And that's what I'm driving at. I understand there's gonna be some leakage. We have a problem with water going into the dam.
So that's one of the things Stephen will talk about, how we took that into account in our modeling.
I think,
The question which maybe covered later on, we have to address it because we come up with our engineering firm we had, was there was a mention that some of the rocks on the downstream side of the dam were loose rocks, again, were figured in a way that made the water coming through to generate electricity less efficient. If we move some of those, we would get more efficient use of our turbines. Did you guys look at that?
We did. Well, we're in progress looking at it. So that's our task 5, which is that tail race and outlet channel modification. So what we did was take Laura's, modeling results, and we built a 2D hydraulic model to look at different flows coming out of the powerhouse, different flows coming out of the gates, and see how, basically we have all the survey information and kind of see how those rocks affect those tailwater levels. So what we're kind of refining those analyses now and looking at the effects of that, but that's part of that scope work to see, could you remove or shift some rocks one way or the other, and how would it benefit you in terms of reducing tailwater levels and improving the hydroelectric generation.
I would just ask one, and Cena may be going to cover this, but I think what I remembered from some of Dr. Marks's work, and you showed the cores that you examined and sent out from a structural standpoint. I think what I got out of his report was that he was indicating that there were lenses within the bedrock which were passing water. In other words, there were channels. There was channelization through there. And I think what he was getting at was whereas they were under the dam, they were creating upward pressure underneath the dam, which then reduces stability. In other words, there's an upward force acting because there's water in some cavities of the rock that's below the dam. And I don't know if the cores indicate that, or if you'll get to that.
This is a metamorphic rock. It's actually a very good rock. It's not limestone, so it's not going to create voids underneath the dam. There are fractures in the rock, and all foundations leak to some extent. This dam is not a gravity dam, so the uplift is not effective. Seems going to get into.
He will. I thought maybe. Okay.
We don't have any concerns right now associated with the water going under the dam, but we haven't seen any signs of where massive amounts of water is coming through the dam. But there probably is water going through these fractures that you see. That's going to happen.
Thank you. I know we want to move on, but there's one final question I'd like to ask on the upstream underwater survey. I'm sure the depth at the dam is not what it was originally. What did we find the depth to be up at the dam face that's been, water displaced by silt, of course, with water in it? And what impact does that have on the stresses of the dam structure?
Yeah.
I will cover that in my
Okay.
Yeah. I can look at the contour map and tell you the depth, and then Cena will talk about the effect of sediment loading on stability. So,
Go back to that.
sorry, I'm just clicking away up here.
While he's doing that, I'm going to ask the council if this might be a good time to take a short break. I'm looking at the time left, and there's a rather hefty presentation. I think Laura might be doing that. I've seen it's doing 25 minutes, and then there's a 20, 30-minute question and answer. I think it's a good time maybe to take about a 10-minute break. And that way those of us who are here in the audience can take advantage of our master bakers production here. We can thank Laura Preegee for the snacks over here. Help yourself. And then the pack sign in. break, be back in about 10 of them. Yes.